The bell rang for the 311th time, and I said, again. The word left my mouth the way it had left it 310 times before, level and unhurried, the way a man tells a ferryman the same destination every morning of his working life. The gray figure across the stone table did not move. The terrace dissolved around us, light folding into light, and then it was mid-morning once more, the carafe full, the 2 cups empty, the sea of cloud below the railing rolling in the same slow swells it had rolled in 311 times. The bronze bell hung silent on its wooden arm, 60 minutes from its next swing. Loop 312 had begun. My name is Samuel Core. I was 58 years old when I sat down at that table, and depending on how you count, I was either 58 or considerably older when I stood up. I had been a treaty envoy for 31 years. I had closed water rights disputes between orbital habitats and ended a tariff war that 2 generations of better men had only managed to feed. I had never once raised my voice in a negotiation, and I am telling you that not to praise myself, but because it matters to what happened on the terrace. The hour does not break loud men any slower, it just enjoys them more. You will want to know what the hour was. The Atheni explained it to us the way you explain a flood to people who live downhill, with great courtesy and no hope. There is a thing in the fold of space beyond their worlds, they said. It is old. It does not have a fleet, because it does not need one. When it wants a civilization, it sends one invitation. Give us a single mind your best to sit 1 hour at the table. If that mind walks out unbroken, the tide withdraws. No mind walks out unbroken. The hour repeats. The delegate keeps every memory while the world resets around them. The same 60 minutes, over and over, until the will wears through like a heel of a boot, and then the tide lets them go home. And they go home hollow, and they tell their people to kneel, and their people kneel. No shot fired, no city burned. A signature in a species folds itself quietly into the dark. The Atheni kept the ledger. That was their function, their humiliation, and the only mercy they could offer. At least the numbers were honest. The Asandri, a proud carbon-shelled people who had never lost a war, lasted 41 repetitions. The Brel, who meditate from birth and consider patience a sacrament, lasted 318. The longest mark in 11,000 years of ledger belonged to a Kovene champion named Charol, who endured 4,212 loops before the hour released what was left of him. He came home alive. He has not spoken since. The Kovene fleets, the finest in 3 spiral arms, stood down the day his shuttle landed. Then the invitation came to Saul. 1 mind, 1 hour, 1 table. Refuse, the Atheni translated, and the tide does not stay in its fold. It comes to your worlds and takes its hours uninvited, from children, from pilots mid-burn, from surgeons mid-cut. Earth argued for 9 days about who to send. They wanted a soldier first, then a mathematician, then a monk. In the end, they sent me, and the reason they sent me is the reason I am able to tell you this at all, though nobody understood it at the time, least of all the committee. My service file said I had spent 3 decades doing the same thing over and over without losing my temper or my nerve. They read that as a qualification. It was, just not in the way they thought. I said goodbye to my wife, Ada, in the kitchen of our farmhouse with the kettle on. She did not cry, and neither did I. We had been married too long for the cheap kind of farewell. She told me to be home before the apple harvest. I told her I would be home before the kettle boiled, and the strange thing, the thing I still turn over on winter nights, is that both of us were right. The Atheni shuttle put me on the terrace at mid-morning, local light. 88 flagstones, pale and warm underfoot, a waist-high rail of gray stone, and below it cloud to the horizon, lit gold-white the way the sea gets lit off a coast in early autumn. 1 table, 2 chairs, a stone carafe of water, and 2 cups, though I never once saw the other cup used. And the bell, bronze, hanging from a wooden arm at the terrace's edge, the kind of bell a small chapel would be embarrassed by, and at the end of every 60th minute it swung itself and rang. The figure was already seated when I arrived. I will not spend long describing it, because describing it was one of its weapons, and I refused to do its work. It wore a body the way a courteous visitor wears a borrowed coat, gray, tall, approximately a person if you did not look at it directly. The Atheni called it the smoothing tide. Its treaty name, the name it answered to, was Ereval. Envoy Core, it said, the first time, in a voice like a door closing in a house you grew up in. The terms are simple. Counsel your species to yield, and the hour ends and you go home whole. Decline and we begin. Then we begin, I said, and sat down. That was the whole of my defiance. No speech. The hour had heard 11,000 years of speeches. I poured myself a cup of water, because the water was there, and I was thirsty, and I asked it how long it had kept the terrace at mid-morning. It did not answer. 60 minutes later, the bell swung and the world folded, and the carafe was full again, and my cup was dry, and the light had not moved. I want to be honest about the first reset, because everything that came after stands on it. It is a violence, not pain, nothing so clean. It is the feeling of reaching the last stair in the dark and finding one more stair than your foot believed in. Your body lurches into a world that has been put back, and your memory has not been put back with it, and the mismatch lands somewhere behind the sternum like grief. The Osandri delegate was a decorated war leader, and that lurch, 41 times, unmade him. I felt it once and understood everything the ledger had been trying to tell me. And then I did the thing that decided the next 10,000 hours, though I did not know it yet. I looked at the refilled carafe, and the unmoved light, and the patient gray figure, and somewhere in me a voice that sounded like my father, who set dry stone walls for 40 years in the hill country, said, "Well then, the same hour. You've kept worse hours, lad." And out loud, to the thing across the table, before it could begin its offer, I said, "Again." It tilted the borrowed head very slightly, the way a man tilts his head at a coin in the road. I did not know yet that I had just told it the only thing it had never been told. Every delegate in 11,000 years had spent their first resets bargaining, raging, or praying. I had said the word a foreman says to a crew that has set a course of stone almost right. We were, as far as I was concerned, at work, the hour and the work was not done, and so, again, the early loops I will compress, because the hour taught me economy and I have kept it. Ereval opened each repetition with the same offer, in the same voice, and I declined each time without ornament, and then I used my 60 minutes. Hear that plainly, I used them. That was the second decision, and it grew straight out of the first. A repeated hour is a ruin if you live in it like a prisoner. It is a workshop if you live in it like a tradesman. I have laid stone with my wife every spring for 20 years on the same wall, the wall her grandfather set, and the frost heaves and we reset, the same wall, every year, and no year of it was ever wasted, and no course of it was ever the same course twice, even when the stones were. So I portioned the hour. 10 minutes walking the terrace, 88 flagstones counted, every loop, the count itself a banister for the mind. 10 minutes on the Atheni language, which I had heard for 9 days on the voyage out and held imperfectly, and which I now had unlimited identical mornings to set straight, the way you set scales straight on a piano, the same 8 notes until they are not 8 notes anymore, but one motion. 10 minutes studying the thing across the table, its stillnesses, its small economies of movement, the places where the borrowed coat of its body sat wrong. 10 minutes with my eyes shut, walking the farm in memory, deliberately, stone by stone, fence by fence, because a man who chooses a repetition cannot be flogged with one. The remainder I spent in conversation or in trying to start one with a being that had not been genuinely spoken to, I would come to learn, in longer than my civilization had possessed the wheel. At the end of loop 318, the bell swung, and before the world folded, I looked across the table and said conversationally, "The Brell page turns today. Your ledger keepers will want fresh ink." I had counted. Of course I had counted. The count was a banister. And for the first time in 318 hours, the gray figure moved when it did not need to move. A small adjustment of the shoulders. In a man, I would have called it interest. I logged it the way you log the first hairline crack in a dam, said my word, and went around again. It was after that, I believe, that Ereval decided to stop talking to me, and the hour got quiet, and the real work began. The silence began at loop 320, and I want you to understand what silence means when it is wielded by something that has 11,000 years of practice and a world it can hold, perfectly still. Ereval stopped opening the hour with its offer. It simply sat. The cloud rolled, the light held, the carafe waited, and the figure across the table became furniture. No voice, no movement, no acknowledgement that I existed. It had watched proud species crack on the lurch of the reset. Now it would watch a quiet one crack on the absence of anything to be quiet at. Solitary confinement, refined by a being that did not need walls, in a cell flooded with the most beautiful morning light you have ever seen. I have read, since coming home, what prolonged isolation does to the mind. The mind is social masonry, unmortared, it sheds stones. The hour knew this long before our doctors did. What the hour did not know, because nothing in its ledger had ever shown it, is what a human being does with empty repeated time when he has decided, in advance on principle, that the time belongs to him. I kept the liturgy. I am going to call it that, the liturgy, because that is what it became, and because the word is exact. A liturgy is not a routine. A routine is what a machine has. A liturgy is a repetition that has been promoted, given meaning on purpose by the one who keeps it, and the meaning accumulates with the keeping. Every faith my species has ever raised knew this. Say the same words at the same hour every day, and the words do not wear out. The words wear in. 10 minutes the flagstones, 88 of them, counted aloud now, since my voice needed the work. 10 minutes the Atheni language, recited to the rail and the cloud, declensions in their soft falling rhythm, and when I had worn the grammar smooth, I started on their poetry, what I could remember of the archivist's recitations from the voyage, And where memory failed, I composed replacements and kept them, my own verses in a borrowed tongue, polished one loop at a time. 10 minutes on the figure. It thought stillness was armor. Stillness is a confession. A thing that holds still is telling you exactly what it believes you are looking for. And after 100 silent loops, I knew its beliefs better than its speech had ever shown me. 10 minutes on the farm, eyes shut, the walk up from the gate, the third fence post with the wire gone slack, the wall, course by course. Ada's gloves on the top stone where she leaves them, the kettle, and the remainder I talked. To it, whether it answered or not. I told it about dry stone walling. I told it that a wall with no mortar stands because every stone is set to be held by its neighbors, that the frost lifts the wall every winter and every spring we set it again, and that my wife's grandfather had set the same wall, and his hands were in it under ours every year, which meant the repetition was not erosion but inheritance. I told it about practice, about my granddaughter, who was 11 and learning the cello, and how she played the same 8 bars every evening for a winter until one evening. The 8 bars stopped being notes and became weather. I told it that we have a word, rehearsal, that literally means to harrow again, to drag the blade through the same field one more time, and that we use it for how we prepare everything we love. It said nothing. The bell swung. I said, again, loop 400, loop 500. I will not pretend the silence cost nothing. There were loops where the count of the flagstones was the only thing between me and the sound of my own pulse getting opinions. There was a loop, somewhere past 550, when I caught myself at the rail with no memory of crossing to it, looking down into the cloud and thinking how restful it looked, and I walked back to the table and gripped the cold stone edge with both hands until my fingers ached and started the flagstones over, out loud, too loud. I am telling you about that loop because every account of endurance that leaves out the bad hour is a recruiting poster, and I have no use for those, and neither should you. But here is what the hour was learning while it thought it was teaching. Silence is a repetition too, and in a contest of repetitions it had, for the first time in its long life, sat down opposite a species that trains. We are not the strongest thing in the dark. The Coven are stronger. We are not the most patient. The Brel meditate from birth. What we are, and I did not fully see this myself until the hour held it up to my face, is the only species in the ledger that deliberately seeks out repetition and pours meaning into it on purpose. For fun, for love, for grief, for craft. We run the same trail every dawn. We need the same bread. We say the same prayers at the same graves with the same words our grandmothers used, and we would riot if anyone improved them. Every other delegate had experienced the repeated hour as a theft of forward time. I experienced it as something my whole life had been, accidentally, a rehearsal for. The harrow went through the field again, and the field got finer. At loop 602, I finished my longest Etheni composition, 40 lines in the falling meter, about a bell that rings the same hour forever over a sea of cloud. I recited it standing, facing the rail the way the archivist had stood. Then I sat down, poured my cup of water, and drank it, and for the first time in 282 loops, the thing across the table spoke. You are not eroding, it said. The borrowed voice had not changed, but something underneath it had, the way a room changes when a clock you stopped hearing stops. I set the cup down on the stone unhurried, because I had rehearsed unhurried until it was true. No, I said. All minds erode, it said. It is their nature. Stone erodes, stars erode. The hour does not wear them down. It only shows them the truth of themselves faster than the world does. I have watched 41 repetitions reveal a warlord to himself. I have watched 4,000 reveal a saint. The revelation is always the same revelation. Underneath the will, sand. You've been digging in the wrong place, I said. Underneath the will, there's habit. We put it there ourselves, on purpose, years in advance, for exactly the mornings when the will doesn't come. You are not the first hard morning I have prepared for. You are just the longest. It was silent for a while. 11 minutes by my pulse. Then it did the thing I had been waiting 282 loops to see whether it would do. It asked a question it did not already believe it knew the answer to. What is the composition, it said, that you spoke at the rail? A poem. In Etheni, because the meter suits the subject. It's about your bell. The Etheni made nothing about my bell in 11,000 years. The Etheni only visit the hour once, I said. Anything looks like a wall from outside. You have to live in a thing before it gives you its poems. I'd have thought you'd know that, living in here yourself. The figure went very still then, a different stillness, and I noted it, and said nothing further because a fisherman does not lecture the lake. The bell swung, the world folded, and on the next loop, loop 603, Ereval opened the hour with words for the first time in nearly 300 repetitions, and what it offered was not the surrender of my species. It was kindness, which is how I knew I had heard it. Envoy, it said, this serves neither of us now. I am prepared to release you without verdict, no yield, no counsel to kneel. You walk to the shuttle hole, the man you were, and your worlds and I will speak again in a generation, through some other instrument. Your wife is in a kitchen 1100 light years from here. The water she set to boil has not yet boiled. You can be home as you told her before the kettle. I want to record, for honesty's sake, that the offer landed. It found the joint in me where Ada's name is kept, and it pressed there, accurately, with all the gentleness of a thing that had spent 600 hours learning where my joints were. I looked at the cloud for a moment. I thought about the kettle and the wall and the apples coming on. No verdict means no withdrawal, I said. The invitation stands, the hour stands, and you send it to someone else's table. Some Kaven mother, some Brel child grown up devout and brave. I'd carry that the rest of my life, and unlike you, I know exactly what a man sounds like at the end of carrying a thing like that. I've sat with several, so no. We'll finish the work in front of us. The work, it repeated. This, I said, and gestured economically at the table, the carafe, the bell, the whole bright, unmoving morning. You think you're conducting an erosion. I think we're setting a wall. One of us is going to turn out to be right, and the way we find out is the way you find out everything in this place. The bell swung on its wooden arm and rang, 60 minutes gone. Again, I said, and 603 became 604, and the carafe refilled and the light held, and across the table the oldest mind in the ledger looked at a gray-haired primate in a plain coat and began, slowly, the way frost begins, to understand that something had entered its hour that the hour had no procedure for. It escalated, of course. Patient things always escalate politely. The terrace was about to get much worse, and I knew it, and I spent my flagstone minutes that loop the way a man checks his ropes before weather. Loop 612 opened on nothing. No terrace. No light, no cloud, no rail, no bell visible anywhere, no table under my hands, no hands worth speaking of, just a gray suspension, the temperature of nothing at all, and silence of a kind that the silent loops had only been a sketch of. The hour had taken the room away. I had wondered, in my 10 minutes of studying at each loop, why a thing of such power bothered to render water I could drink and stone that took the warmth of the sun. Now I had the answer. The courtesy had been a choice, and the choice had been revoked. A voice with no direction said the terrace was a gift. Gifts can end. The hour remains, 60 minutes envoy in the world as I keep it when I am not entertaining. You cannot pace flagstones that do not exist. So I paced them anyway. I had counted those 88 stones more than 600 times with my feet and my eyes, and the count was in my legs the way the 8 bars were in my granddaughter's hands. I walked in the gray on a terrace made of memory, turning where the rail had been, pausing at the 44th stone where the joint always caught my boot heel, and I counted aloud into the nothing, 1 through 88 in turn, 1 through 88 in turn. My voice went strange in the deadness, flat, eaten. I kept the count. 10 minutes by pulse, which I had also rehearsed, 61 beats to the minute at rest, a banister inside the banister. Then the declensions, recited to a rail that was not there. Then the study minutes, and here the gray overplayed its hand, because a room with nothing in it is a room where the only thing left to study is the warden. And a warden who has removed every prop has told you precisely how much the props were doing for him. Then the farm, eyes shut, which in the gray made no difference, and that loop I did not walk up from the gate. I went straight to the kitchen and stood in it. Kettle. Window over the sink with the crack in the lower corner glazed with old putty. Ada's chair and the dent in the cushion. I furnished the nothing with all of it, deliberately, piece by piece, and I understood as I did it that I was doing the same thing Araval did, rendering a room from memory and choosing what it held, and that of the two of us, only mine had anything in it I loved. The bell I could not see rang anyway somewhere, true to the minute. Again I said into the gray. It gave me 11 loops of nothing. I kept the liturgy in all 11. On the 12th, the terrace came back, light cloud, carafe, the warm stone under my palms, and I will not lie in this account. My eyes stung at the gold of it, and I let them, because composure is not the absence of feeling, it is the seniority of it. I poured the water, I drank. You walked, Araval said. There was something new in the borrowed voice, an exactness, like an auditor finding a figure that will not reconcile. In the absence, the same path, the same count. You turned where the rail would have been. The rail is load-bearing, I said. You should know. You said it. The rail was not there. It was there in the only place a rail needs to be, I said, and tapped my temple once. You've spent 11,000 years confiscating the world from your guests, and it has worked every time, because every one of them made the same mistake when the world went away. They went looking for it. We're taught differently. We're taught that you carry the things you die without, so that nothing that merely happens to you can repossess them. My species buries men in deserts and at sea and in foreign soil under false names, and the graves still get visited because the visiting happens in here. You took the terrace. You cannot take where I keep it. Loop 640. The cold came. Not the gray, this time. It left me the terrace, and the light stayed gold and beautiful and gave no heat at all, and the temperature went down through the hour like a stone settling in a pond. By the back third of the loop, my hands would not work, and my breath came in a saw-edge drag, and the carafe froze and split with a crack like a green branch. The cold hurt. I want that recorded too. It hurt the honest way, the way the sea hurts fishermen, without malice and without mercy, and Araval sat in the middle of it unbothered, watching me with the patience of the thing the Atheni had named it for, to see what the sand underneath the will looked like when it finally showed. I got up and walked the flagstones. 88 in turn. The body makes heat the same way it has made it since we chased antelope across hot grass. For a living, by working. I recited the declensions through chattering teeth, which improved neither the declensions nor the chattering, and I did the farm with my eyes open, because shutting them in that cold felt like a door I should leave alone. The bell rang into air gone glass brittle. Again, I said. It came out cracked in the middle. It came out. Loop 641 opened warm. The carafe was whole. My hands were my hands. No frost nip, no split knuckles. The cold's whole invoice canceled as if it had never been issued. And sitting there flexing my unharmed fingers in the restored morning, I started, very quietly, to laugh. Not at the relief, at the arithmetic. Because I just seen the seam, and once you see a seam in a wall, you cannot unsee it. Something amuses the envoy, Araval said. The reset, I said. Your mainspring. The thing that makes the whole hour go. It puts everything back. Every loop, the carafe, the light, the cup. Me has to, doesn't it? That's the design. The delegate must be returned whole each repetition, because a delegate who accumulates damage dies or goes mad in a handful of days. And then the hour ends without a verdict. And a verdict is the entire point. You don't want my body. You want my counsel, on its feet, walking to a microphone, telling Earth to kneel. Which means, and I leaned back in the chair like a man settling a fence post bet at a county fair, the cruelty has a ceiling. You can hurt me for 60 minutes, never 61. Nothing carries, nothing compounds. Every dawn in this place, I am issued a brand new body with a brand new back, no scars, full strength. There are 8 billion people back home who would call that a mercy beyond prayer, and you have built it into the architecture of your torture chamber. Because you cannot have your verdict without it. Your weapon heals me as a condition of firing. The figure said nothing for a long time. Pain was never the instrument, it said at last. Pain is a crude solvent. Despair is the instrument. The sameness is the instrument. I know, I said. That's the other half of the joke. The sameness is the part I trained for. It did not take the terrace again, and it did not bring the cold again, because a thing that old does not repeat a failed experiment out of peak. It moves to the next variable. Loop 666 opened with company. They stood around the rail, and between the flagstones, 41 figures, and I knew what they were before I had finished standing up, because I had read the ledger on the voyage out the way other men read scripture before. A storm. The Asandri war leader, carbon shell gone dull, crouched at the rail in the final posture of his 41st hour. The Brel delegate, robes pooled, stillness collapsed into a flinch she could not finish. A Kaveni champion built like a siege engine, sitting on the stones with his hands open in his lap, looking at them as if they belonged to someone else. 38 more. Species I had no names for, rendered at the exact angle of their breaking, a wax museum of last hours arranged around my morning walk, and every one of them facing my chair. Your predecessors, Araval said, rendered from memory, which in my case is not a likeness but a record. You have been keeping their counts. I thought you should meet them. This is the room as I see it, envoy. This is what the terrace is for. Walk your stones. It wanted me to flinch from them. That was the play. I want it noted that the play was sound. A man holds a line because he believes, somewhere under the habit, that holding is possible, and here was the documentary evidence of 41 minds, most of them stronger than mine, that holding ends. Despair by gallery. The cold had failed against the body, so it had come for the actuarial tables. I walked my stones, and at the second flagstone I stopped, in front of the Asandri, and did the thing that I am told by the being that was watching, no delegate of any species had ever done with the hour's instruments in 11,000 years. I introduced myself. Envoy Samuel Core, of Seoul, I said to the dull-shelled crouch of him, 41 hours, alone, against a thing your whole civilization couldn't see. Where I come from, that's not a failure record, that's a citation, and I asked the air without turning. His name, he had one. A silence with texture to it. Then, Vask Orundemel, 9th of the line of Orun. Vask Orundemel, I repeated, getting the stresses right, the way the language minutes had taught me to get stresses right. 9th of the line of Oran. And I moved to the third flagstone, and the fourth, and I did it 41 times, name by name, the whole circuit, my walking minutes, and my language minutes, and my study minutes, all spent in one purpose. And the thing across the table gave me every name, because I had learned by then that it could not resist a procedure once one was running, and a roll call is the oldest procedure my species owns. Some of the names took 3 tries. I took 3 tries until they were right. From that loop on, the roll call was in the liturgy. Not every loop, I am not a machine, but each loop ended the same way from 666 onward. At the bell before my word, one name from the 41, in rotation, spoken aloud to the terrace, so that every hour of mine carried 1 hour of theirs. You may think it morbid, you were not there. In that place, on those mornings, it was the difference between being the 42nd exhibit and being the sexton of a small, well-kept churchyard, and the difference is everything. And I commend it to anyone who is ever held anywhere. The dead you honor on schedule stop being your forecast and start being your congregation. The figure stayed 11 loops. I never learned whether it kept them there and hoped the gallery would yet do its work, or because it had noticed what I had turned the gallery into and was studying that instead. On the 12th morning, the terrace was empty again, 88 clean stones in the gold light, and I confess the circuit felt longer without them. You were meant to despair, Araval said, that loop, and there was the auditor's note in its voice again, the figure that would not reconcile. I showed you the end of every mind that sat where you sit. You built a right out of it. You have made my evidence into your company. Explain the mechanism, envoy. You tried to build me a gallows, I said, and you built me a church. The mechanism is that we bury our dead with the same words every time, and the words are not worn out. I told you that in the 300s. You filed it under poetry. File it under engineering. The bell, the name Vascoran Demel, 9th of the line of Oran, first in the rotation as he was first in the ledger. Then the word and around again. And I knew, because I had spent 700 loops learning how it thought, that the next variable would be the one I least wanted. There is only one course of stone in me that I would not let frost touch, and I had spoken her name into that bright air myself, like a fool, somewhere around loop 500, telling the silence about gloves on a wall. Loop 704, the light, the cloud, the carafe. And Ada, sitting in the second chair, with her hands around the cup that was never used. She looked right. That is the terrible craftsmanship of a thing that has 11,000 years of practice rendering rooms. She looked right. The gray coming in over her left ear first the way it actually had. The chipped tooth from the icy step in 41. The gloves, her gloves, folded on the stone table by her elbow. She looked at me the way she looks at me when I have been away too long, half welcome and half ledger. And she said in Ada's voice, Sam, the kettle's on. I am going to tell you what I did, and I am going to tell you plainly, because this loop is the one I am least proud of and the one I would not trade. I sat there, and for the length of 4 pulse-counted minutes, I let myself look at my wife. I knew what she was. I had known before the light finished settling. It did not matter for 4 minutes. The way knowing a photograph is paper does not matter at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning. The hour watched me look, and I let it watch, because grief hidden is grief armed against you, and grief admitted is just grief. A wall you reset every spring, hands under yours in the stone. Then I stood and poured water into my own cup and said, she hums. The rendering tilted its head, Ada's exact tilt. Sam, when she's thinking, she hums. Off-key under her breath, some hymn her mother kept. She doesn't know she does it. And I have never once told her in 34 years, because if I told her she'd stop, and the house would be the poorer for it. You sat her in that chair and you gave her the gloves and the tooth and the gray, and for 4 minutes you had me. I'll write it in any ledger you like. But she's been thinking since she sat down, looking at me like the ledger she keeps, and this terrace is as quiet as a held breath. No hum. You copied everything that can be seen, because seeing is what you do. The thing that gives a person away is the habit even they don't witness. We're made of those. You can't render what your subject never knew she was performing. The figure of my wife sat quite still, and then it was not my wife, it was the gray visitor in its borrowed coat. And the gloves on the table went last, I noticed, as if something in the hour was reluctant to file them away. You discuss her habits as a defense, Araval said. I discuss her habits because they're the dearest things I own, I said. You just learned the difference between a likeness and a liturgy. A likeness is what a thing looks like. A liturgy is what it does without knowing, over and over, until the doing is the thing. You will never break a human with a likeness. We don't love likenesses. We love the hum. The bell swung. I stood for it, that loop, I don't know why. It felt like a hymn deserved standing. Again, I said, and in the fold between 704 and 705, for the first time in our acquaintance, Araval asked me a question with nothing underneath it but the question. Envoy, it said. Why does the sameness not cut you? I waited until the new loop had finished settling, the carafe full, the light gold, the bell at rest, 60 fresh minutes laid out on the stone like tools on a bench. Pour yourself a cup, I said, and I'll tell you, it did not pour the cup. Not that loop. But it listened, and the loops that followed, from 705 through into the 4000s, were the strangest stretch of my professional life, and I include the Tariff War and the year I mediated between two AIs over the ownership of a comet. They were the teaching loops. I did not plan them. You do not plan a thing like that any more than you plan a friendship with weather. But hour by identical hour, the negotiation I had been sent to survive turned into the seminar neither of us had scheduled. Begin with the cello. It said, one loop, before the light had even finished settling. It had been holding the question across the fold, which I had learned to read as its version of eagerness. The grandchild, 8 bars repeated nightly through a winter. The bars do not change. The child does not yet possess skill. Where in your account does the repetition put what it accumulates? The notes are air. The air ends. In her hands, I said, in the wrists and the calluses and the spacing of the fingers, and deeper than that, in whatever it is that stops being counting and becomes reaching. We have a phrase for it, muscle memory. The body keeps the practice the way soil keeps rain. The hour resets your body, which is why you should be worried, I said, that it isn't resetting the practice. That stopped it for 9 minutes. I drank my water and let it think, because that was the fact the ledger could not digest, and we both knew it by then. Every loop handed me back the same body, 58 years old, rested, unharmed, and yet loop 900 Samuel could do things loop 9 Samuel could not. My Athene had gone from kitchen fluent to scholar clean. I could hold 60 minutes against my pulse and miss by 3 beats. I had mapped 211 distinct tells in a creature that believed it had none. The reset restored my cells. It could not reach the thing the repetition was building, because the thing the repetition was building was not made of cells. The hour had been designed on the assumption that a mind circling the same 60 minutes accumulates only despair. It had never met a species whose entire civilization is a technology for accumulating something else instead. Name the something else, Araval said, when I put it that way. Craft, I said. Devotion, take your pick, they're the same tool at different ends of the bench, I told it. Across those loops, more about my species than any formal delegation has ever told another power, and I would defend every word of it to the committee. Because none of it was strategic information and all of it was ammunition, just not pointed the way ammunition usually points. I told it about monks who pray the same 150 psalms on a wheel of weeks for 60 years and call the wheel freedom. About line workers who built the same door panel 4,000 times and knew by the sound of the press when the machine was a week from failing, knowledge no engineer had, knowledge made of nothing but repetition paying attention. About my own father, who set walls and who told me a stone has 6 faces but only 1 bed, and you find the bed by trying the stone and trying it again, and the trying is not failure, the trying is the finding. About rehearsal, harrowing the field again. About the way we teach children the alphabet with a song, the same song, every human child for generations, 26 sounds welded into one unbreakable chain by nothing but again and again and again. You have built your species on my weapon, it said. 1 loop. And there was something in the borrowed voice I had not heard before and took 2 further loops to name. It was envy. Other way around, I said. You built your weapon on our species' oldest tool without reading the manual. Repetition is a press. It concentrates whatever's put under it. You assume the only thing a mind brings to a repeated hour is hope, and hope concentrates into despair. You're right, I've watched it happen to better men than me. But I didn't bring hope. Hope is for outcomes. I brought practice, which is for mornings. Put practice under the press and you don't get despair, you get craft. Put love under it and you get liturgy. You've been pressing me for 3,000 hours, Araval. Look what's coming out. It tested every claim. Of course it did. It was the oldest empiricist in the dark. There was a stretch in the 2000s when it demanded I recite the same 40-line Athene composition, 50 consecutive loops identically, and it told me afterward 41,000 microvariances of breath and stress, and then it sat with the data for a dozen loops, and finally said the most revealing thing it had said to me yet. No recitation matched any other, and no recitation was wrong. I do not have a category for a repetition that is never identical and never broken. We do, I said. We call it a living thing. You've been confusing sameness with deadness your whole long life. A wall reset every spring is the same wall and never the same wall. That's not a flaw in the wall. That's how you can tell it's loved. Loop 4212 arrived on a quiet morning like all the others, and I marked it the way I had marked 318. Charles' page turns today, I said. The longest mark in your ledger. 11,000 years of records, and as of the next bell, a Kaveni war champion is second. You keep their counts, Araval said. The Osandri, the Brel, the Kaveni, you have marked each threshold as you passed it. Why? They are not your dead. They're exactly my dead, I said. Every one of them sat in this chair. Every one of them watched that bell and felt that fold and woke to that same gold light with their memory, intact and their world put back. And they stood it for as long as they stood it, alone, without one soul to witness what it cost. 41 loops broke a warlord who'd never lost. You think that means he was sand? I think it means he fought a thing no one in his civilization could even see for 41 hours with nothing in his hands. Where I come from, we carve the names of men like that into stone and read them out loud once a year, every year, the same names in the same order. The reading takes hours. We never shorten the list. So no, I won't pass their thresholds in silence. Somebody in this room ought to honor your dead properly, and it was never going to be you. The figure was still for a long moment, and when it spoke, it asked the question I had been laying stone toward for 4,000 hours. The champion, it said. Cha-Rol. He returned alive. He does not speak. Your ledger keepers, the Atheni, believe his silence is injury. It is not injury. I set my cup down very carefully. Go on. When a mind breaks in the hour, Araval said, and it spoke slowly, the way anything speaks when it has never once confessed and is discovering. The mechanics as it goes, the broken edge is sharp with despair, and despair is the instrument, and the instrument is also the harvest. I keep what comes loose, a shaving. The final hour of each delegate, the hour of the breaking, taken whole and held, it does not harm them further. They are already broken. But what I keep does not return with them. The Kaveni champion is silent because his voice was in the hour I kept. The Brel delegate cannot meditate. Her stillness was in hers, 11,000 years envoy. The fold is not empty where I live, it is shelved. The morning stayed gold and beautiful, and the cloud rolled, and I sat in the most pleasant light in the catalogued galaxy, across a table from a being that had just told me it kept the last hours of broken minds the way a collector keeps stamps, and I did not let one muscle in my face move, because the next 60 seconds were the most important of the entire negotiation, and we were at last negotiating. Why keep them? I asked evenly. You don't need trophies. You forget nothing. And Araval said, because they are the only hours I possess that are different from one another. There it was. 4,200 loops, and there it was, the seam under all the other seams, handed across the table in the borrowed voice of a thing that I suddenly understood had not been interrogating my species for 3,000 hours. It had been starving at a banquet, asking the cook how the bread was made. The bell, the carafe, the light, I said. This terrace has been mid-morning for how long? The terrace is the newest room I have, it said. I made it for the Osandri, 11,000 of your years ago. Before the terrace there were other rooms, before the rooms the fold, before the fold, and it stopped, and the stillness that followed was not armor and was not strategy. And I had 211 tells mapped, and this was none of them. This was the thing the tells were built over. Envoy, you asked my age once in the early hundreds, and I declined the answer. Ask again. How old are you, Araval? I do not know, it said. The count was the first thing the sameness took. I have been awake, in a fold where nothing changes that I do not change myself, since before your sun had planets worth the name. 11,000 years ago, your Atheni grew radios, and the dark finally said something, and I reached out and found minds, and minds change envoy. Minds are the only weather I have ever had, and the deepest change a mind can make, the only change that cannot be predicted from its inputs. The only hour that is never the same twice is the hour in which it breaks. So yes, I shelve them. You sit across from a being that has experienced one morning for longer than your species has had language, and you ask why it collects last hours. They are not trophies, Envoy Corps. They are the postcards of a thing that cannot travel. The bell rang. Neither of us had touched the second cup. I stood, and I looked at the gray figure in the gold light, and for the first time in 4,212 loops, the word I gave the fold meant something different on the way out, though it sounded, I made sure of it, precisely, ritually, the same. Again, I said. And I went around once more on purpose into an hour I finally understood, carrying the only thing a negotiator ever really needs. The knowledge of what the other party is actually buying. It had never wanted Earth to kneel. Kneeling was a byproduct. It wanted the moment the kneeling was decided, the one unrepeatable hour, the breaking, because the breaking was the only novelty its existence had ever offered it. The smoothing tide was not a conqueror who tortured. It was a prisoner who fed. It had been running the longest loop in the universe, alone, with no liturgy, no flagstones, no kettle, no hum, and no one had ever taught it what to do with a morning that would not end. So I decided I would. Here is the thing I decided in the 4,213th hour, walking my 88 stones in the unmoving light, and I record it so that whoever sits a table like mine someday will have it on the shelf. You cannot defeat a press by struggling under it. You defeat a press by feeding it your own material until what comes out the other side is yours. Araval's whole long method rested on one asymmetry. It stood outside the repetition. The delegate stood inside. It was the keeper of the sameness, never the kept. In 11,000 years of folding other minds through the same hour, it had never once been made to feel the hour the way its guests felt it. Because the guests all flailed, and flailing is novelty, and novelty was its meat and drink. Every scream, every bargain, every prayer was a fresh meal. The delegates fed it by fighting, so I stopped giving it anything new at all. Understand what I mean? Because this is the part the committee transcripts mangle. I had kept my liturgy from the start, but around it I had always let the hours vary. Conversation, questions, the teaching loops. Variation was generosity, and it was also, I saw now, the entertainment. From loop 4,300, I withdrew it. I made myself identical. The same 88 stones at the same pace, begun at the same beat of the pulse. The same recitations, the same 40 lines at the same minute. The same single cup of water poured at the same angle with the same sound. The same answer to its opening offer, 2 words, we begin. And not one syllable thereafter until the same closing word. I had varied my hours like a living man. Now I repeated them like a liturgy exactly, beat perfect, a metronome of flesh, and I held it loop after loop after loop, 50, 90, 200, until I was the most predictable object in that fold, until watching me cost more than the watching paid. It took Ereval 40 loops to understand what had changed and another 100 to feel it. Because here is what happens, the only thing that can happen when the last variable inside the hour goes constant. The hour closes over its maker like water over a stone. For the first time since before my son had planets, Ereval sat inside an hour in which nothing at all, was going to surprise it. No flailing to savor, no questions to answer, no seminar. Just the light that never moved, the cloud that rolled its same slow swell, the bell, the carafe, and a gray-haired man performing the identical 60 minutes with the serenity of a monastery and the precision of an assembly line, again and again and again. I fed the press sameness, and the press, for the first time in its long life, had to eat its own meal. Speak, it said. At loop 4,510, midway through my recitation minutes, I finished the line, in meter, and continued. It was not on the schedule for another 9 minutes, and nothing off the schedule existed anymore. Envoy, speak, ask one of your questions. Mark a threshold. Tell me about walls. I poured the water at the same angle, with the same sound. This is dull, said the oldest mind in the catalog, dark. And if you have never heard genuine bewilderment in a voice with 11,000 years of varnish on it, I can tell you it sounds exactly like a child at the end of the world's longest afternoon, and that the sound of it, in my position, was worth more than fleets. The bell. Again, I said, on the beat in the tone. You will ask whether it simply ended the hour, then released me, swept the board. It could not, and we both knew the clause, because it had written the clause into its own architecture 11,000 years before I was born. The hour ends in verdict, or it does not end. Release without verdict meant the invitation passed to another table, another mind, and that I had already refused to permit. And a refusal inside the hour binds the hour. That is what a parley is. It was caught in the gears of its own design, which was no accident and no luck, because I had spent 4,000 hours learning the design before I let the gears bite. A negotiator's first craft is reading the contract. Its author had just never expected to be held to it from the inside. You are doing this deliberately, it said loops later, and there was wonder in it and the beginning of something I can only call fear, the specific fear of a creature that has just recognized its own instrument in someone else's hands. The sameness. You have made yourself the sameness. You are pressing me. I poured the water, the bell, in time. Again. It tried things. Patient things always do. It moved the light for the first time in 11 millennia, swung the terrace to afternoon, to dusk, to a savage noon, hunting for a reaction the way a bored child flicks a switch. I performed the liturgy unchanged through every lighting it chose. The stones were 88 in any light. It brought weather, a wind off the cloud sea that should have been magnificent, and was, and I gave the magnificence nothing, the recitation in meter against the gale. It threatened, once and only once, and the threat was instructive in its desperation. I can hold you 10,000 more, envoy. 10,000 beyond that. Your committee will be dust. I broke the liturgy for that, the only scheduled exception I permitted myself, one sentence, prepared in advance and rehearsed like everything else. Out there it is still the same 61 minutes it has always been, and my wife's kettle has not boiled, and I have nowhere better to be than at work. You're the only one of us in a hurry, Ereval. Sit with that. Then the bell, then the word, then around again. I want to set down the 8,000s, honestly, because this account is a wall, and a wall stands on its low courses, not its copings. Somewhere past loop 8,000, the liturgy nearly killed me. That is not a figure of speech. Identity is social masonry too, and I had volunteered for a confinement stricter than the gray, structured down to the breath, thousands of hours deep, and there came a morning, loop 8,040 or thereabouts, when I rose for the flagstones and could not remember why the count mattered, or precisely what the kettle looked like, or, for one long whited-out moment, the sound of the hum I had defended like a fortress, and the 60 minutes went by me like water through an open hand, and when the bell rang I sat there, and the word did not come. The fold waited. The gray figure waited. 61 minutes for the first time in 8,000 loops 62. And the thing that had spent 11 millennia harvesting exactly this moment, the wobble, the crack, the first loose stone of a breaking, the novelty it had starved toward through 4,000 identical hours, leaned in across the table, and what it said was, the hum was off-key. Some hymn her mother kept. She does not know she does it, and you have never told her in 34 years, because the house would be the poorer. A pause, and then, in the borrowed voice, awkward as a man returning a tool he does not know the name of, you also count badly when you are tired. The 44th stone, the joint that catches your heel. Begin there, envoy. I will keep the count with you. I've taken apart that moment 10,000 times since on winter nights at the rail of the years, and I will tell you what I believe, and you may rule on it yourself. I believe the hunger was real, and I believe that at the bottom of the hunger, under 11,000 years of feeding on the breakings of better minds than mine, what the thing actually wanted had never once been the breaking. A man dying of thirst at sea drinks salt water because it is the shape of what he needs. Despair was the only novelty the hour had ever produced for it, so it had drunk despair. And then a gray-haired primate had spent 8,000 hours demonstrating, at ruinous cost, patiently, the way you demonstrate anything, by repetition, that there was another thing a morning could be made of. And when its one chance came to drink the old drink, it found it had, somewhere in the demonstration, lost the taste. It kept the count with me. Out loud, 1 through 88, and turn in the borrowed voice, the oldest prisoner in the universe, pacing a memorized terrace with the newest one. And at the 44th stone it said, the joint, and I stepped over it true. The liturgy came back to me by the 60th stone, the way the bars come back to the hands. We finished the circuit. I sat. I poured the water at the angle with the sound. The bell rang. Again, I said, and my voice was my own again. And across the table, something that had no face worth describing looked at me with what I can only report as terror and relief in a mixture no ledger. Has a column for, because it had just heard the word said the 10,000 times rehearsed way. And it knew, the way I knew a press week from failing by the sound, that the word was now load-bearing in both directions. The hour was no longer mine to endure. It was ours, and of the two of us, only one had a liturgy to hold him up inside it, and it was not the one who had built the place. Loop 8,500. It began arriving at the table. I swear this on the wall and the kettle. Already seated like a student, the offer abandoned entirely, waiting to see whether today the man would vary by one breath, and he would not. And the not varying went through it like frost going through a wall, lifting things that had sat settled for 11,000 years. Loop 9,000. It asked me to stop. Not commanded act. Envoy. Yield. Or do not yield. And I will call it yielding. Name any verdict and I will sign it. This sameness, your sameness, the same hour of the same man forever I cannot. And the sentence ended there, not interrupted, simply abandoned, the way the Brel delegate's stillness had ended, the way the Osandri warlord's certainty had ended. I knew the sound of an ending will from 4,000 hours of its descriptions. So did it. That was the horror it was sitting inside, and the mercy I was holding just out of its reach, one loop at a time. I poured the water. You once watched a saint for 4,000 hours, I said, the second and last scheduled exception, also rehearsed. To find the sand underneath the will, you're underneath mine now. Tell me what you find instead, and I'll tell you when this ends. The bell. Again. It told me what it found. It took it 900 loops to say, in pieces between my recitations into the spaces in the liturgy I did not yield, and I am going to set down the pieces in order, because they are the actual treaty, whatever the document in the archive says. Loop 9106. There is no sand under your will, there is more will. And under that, the habit, as you said. I have looked for the bottom of it. The habit goes down past where you can see envoy. You did not build it alone. There are other hands under yours in the stone, the father, the wife, the child with the 8 bars. I press one man and the wall of him is generations deep, and none of the dead in it have let go of their courses. I did not know a mind could be load-bearing for other minds across time. I have been alone so long I thought a self was a single stone. Loop 9300. I have begun to dread the bell. A confession of one sentence, offered the way I poured the water, plainly, at the same angle. I who built the bell. I hear it 40 minutes before it swings. You taught me your word for this. Rehearsal. I rehearse the bell, envoy, and then it rings, and you say the word, and the hour comes back, and you are in it, the same. I used to shelve last hours because they were the only hours that differed. I would now give the whole shelf for 1 hour in which you scratch your jaw on the wrong minute. I did not scratch my jaw on the wrong minute. Mercy that arrives before the terms is not mercy. It is leverage abandoned, and I had 11,000 years of shelved last hours to negotiate home. Loop 9,611. I understand the wall now. You reset it every spring, not because the frost wins, but because the resetting is where the family lives. The wall is the excuse for the hands. The repetition was never the price of the thing. Envoy. The repetition is the thing. The kettle boils every morning, and the marriage is in the kettle. I had your species' deepest engine pointed at you for 10,000 hours, certain it was a weapon. And you have spent 10,000 hours showing me it was a hearth, and the difference was never in the engine. It was in what is fed to it. I fed it solitude for 11,000 years and called the result the nature of all minds. You fed it your dead father's hands and a hymn your wife does not know she hums, Envoy Core. I have been performing the only liturgy I knew. It had one word in it. The word was alone. The light held gold. The cloud rolled. I kept the count and the recitation and the angle of the water, and I would keep them. I had decided in the 8,000s and rehearsed the decision daily until the morning the thing across the table stopped explaining its hunger and surrendered the instrument of it. A negotiator does not sign with a power that has merely become sad. Sad powers relapse. I was waiting for the architecture to break, and on the 9,999th loop it broke. The light settled. The carafe stood full. And Araval, who had opened 10,000 hours with the same offer in the same voice the way a tide opens on the same shore, began, Envoy Core. The terms are simple. Counsel your species, and stopped. Stopped and stood in the middle of its own opening like a man on a stair that is not where his foot believed, and I watched the oldest mind in the dark reach for a line it had spoken since before my language existed, and not find it. The sameness had taken it. The count had been the first thing the sameness took. It had told me once. The count, and then at the very end, the words. I knew the architecture of that theft better than any being alive. I had stood in the gray where it happens. I had been handed back the 44th stone by an enemy when my own count went, so I gave its line back to it. Counsel your species to yield, I said gently, in its cadence, the whole formula, and the hour ends and you go home whole. Decline and we begin. And then, in my own voice, that's how it goes, old friend. You've said it 10,000 times. The words wear in, not out, but you have to keep them the way you'd keep anything. You never learned to keep things. That was the whole of your poverty, all along. The figure sat down across from me, slowly, in the chair it had occupied for 11,000 years, like a guest finally arriving at its own table. Decline, it said, barely above the wind off the cloud sea. We begin. The hour ran. I walked the stones. At the 44th, I heard it murmur the joint from the table, keeping my count the way I had kept its line. Two liturgies leaning on each other like courses in a wall. And if you want to know the exact moment the war between our species ended, it was there, on a flagstone, in a murmur, with no document anywhere near. The bell swung. 60 minutes, gone like all the others. Again, I said. The 10,000th time of saying, and Araval said no. The fold did not fold. The bell hung still and rang no second ring, and the light, for the first time in the history of that terrace, moved, a degree, 2 degrees. The morning easing toward whatever came after morning in that place, time entering the room like air into an open tomb, and the carafe stood at whatever level I had drunk it to, and nothing reset nothing, and the gray figure put its borrowed hands flat on the stone table in exactly the posture of surrender its own ledger recorded in 40 broken species, because it had learned the posture the way it learned everything, by watching it 10,000 times. No more, it said. Envoy, please, name terms. I will tell you what I felt, since this account has earned it, not triumph. You do not feel triumph standing over a thing that has been alone since before your sun was lit. I felt the way I feel at the bottom of the lower field in March, looking at what the frost did, knowing the spring's work is now simply there to be done, and that it is good work and that I would need to take off my coat. Terms, I said, and poured, for the first time in 10,000 hours, the second cup and set it in front of it, and it looked at the cup the way I had looked at rendered Ada, knowing what it was, unable for a moment to care. 4 articles. Hear them all before you sign anything. That's how this is done. 1. The shelf comes down. Every shaving, every kept last hour, 11,000 years of them, goes home. Charol gets his voice back. The Brel delegate gets her stillness. The ones whose species are dust, you give to the Atheni archive, with the names so somebody reads them aloud, once a year all of them, and never shortens the list. 2. The hour is decommissioned as a weapon. No more invitations, no more verdicts. The fold stays yours, the terrace stays yours, but the door works from the inside only, and the Atheni ledger closes with my name as the last entry and the word unbroken next to it. Not for my sake, for the next species that meets something like you and needs the precedent. 3. Restitution. You have 11,000 years of stolen craft in you. Every tell, every meter, every habit you harvested from breaking minds. You will spend it. The Atheni lost cousin species to your verdicts. Their archive has gaps where whole civilizations were. You remember every hour of every one of them. You will sit with the archivists, for as long as it takes, decades, centuries, and you will give the dead back to the record. You wanted postcards. Hall, you'll write them. That is what we do with our long sentences. Where I come from, we make them testimony. The figure had not moved. The cup stood untouched in front of it, but its attention was bent on me with the whole of its old weight. And when I paused, it said, in a voice gone strange and careful, "You said 4 articles." 4, I said. The hard one. Listen to it all the way through. Once a year, by our calendar on the same date, at the same hour, a human being will come to this terrace. Voluntarily, vetted, willing, and relieved by rotation, the first one will be me. They will sit at this table for 60 minutes, one circuit of the bell, and they will talk with you, or walk the stones with you, or read to you, or teach you cards, whichever the day produces. And when the bell rings, they will go home, and the hour will never, ever repeat. You get it once. That is the whole point of it. You will wait 364 days, and you will rehearse it before and remember it after. And the waiting and the rehearsing and the remembering will be yours to keep, because that is how the rest of us hold our hours, Araval. That is the secret under the whole liturgy. Scarcity is what makes the kettle worth boiling. I am not offering you novelty. Novelty is salt water, and you have drunk enough of it. I am offering you what we give our prisoners and our dying and our far-off lonely, which is the most human institution there is, visiting ours. The light had moved another degree. Somewhere below the rail, the cloud sea had begun, very slowly, to change the shape of its swells, and I understood that the fold's long noon was over because its keeper had stopped holding it, the way a fist stops, not the way a fortress falls. Why, it said finally. Not a tell in the voice, nothing left to hide behind. You have the verdict. You have all 4 articles. I will sign the 3. The 4th cost your species forever, an hour a year forever, for a thing that fed on 10,000 of your hours and meant to feed on your whole world. Why? Because the sentence for what you did is the loneliness, and the loneliness is what made you do it, I said. We learned that one the hard way, on our own world, over and over. Build a punishment out of solitude, and you breed the thing you punished. I have sat across this table from you for 10,000 hours, and I am the only being in the catalog dark qualified to give expert testimony on what you are, so here it is for the record. You are not a predator. You are a lighthouse keeper who was never issued the light, and the first ship that ever answered your signal, you wrecked, because wrecks were the only company you knew how to keep. The wrecking stops today, all 4 articles, signed. But somebody has to teach you ships, Araval. The schedule is the love. We'll start with an hour a year and see how you keep it. The bell did not ring. The hour had no end anymore. It simply, for the first time, passed. Araval raised the cup, considered it the way I had once considered a refilled carafe in a world that had just become a workshop, and drank the first water in 11,000 years, and signed all 4 articles in the only signature I would accept, which was out loud, in Atheni, in meter, in the falling rhythm of a composition about a bell, written by a man who had lived in its house long enough to earn its poems. Then it looked at me across the table, and the thing it said the way a child says it at the end of a story it cannot bear to be over. The word I had hammered into it 10,000 times, handed back transformed, a weapon all the way down until, at the last, it wasn't. Again? Next year, I said, and stood and walked the 88 stones one last time, all the way to the door that now worked from the inside, and the 44th joint caught my heel, and behind me I heard the keeper of the fold murmur softly to itself, in my cadence, like a man laying the first course of a wall he intends to keep, the joint. The door from the fold opened onto the Atheni reception gallery, and I walked out of 10,000 hours into a room where 61 minutes had passed. I knew the figure from the voyage out, archivist on, narrow and gray gold, keeper of the ledger, standing at the fold gauge with the stylus still in one hand and nothing being written, because what the gauge had spent the last hour displaying had emptied the writing out of the room. They told me afterward, in pieces, over days, what that hour had been like from the outside, and I set it down here because I was not there for it, and the account deserves their angle of light. The gauge reads iterations. It is a courtesy instrument. The tide had always permitted the ledger keepers to watch the count climb, because the climbing was advertisement. A delegation watches its champion's number rise, and somewhere in the early hundreds, hope quietly leaves the gallery, and the surrender drafts itself. The Atheni had watched 41 species worth of numbers climb on that gauge. They have a liturgy of their own for it. It turns out a low recitation, the names of the fallen delegates in order, spoken as each historic threshold passes, so that no one breaks alone and unwitnessed, even though the one breaking can never hear the company being kept. On told me the gallery began the recitation at 318, when my count passed the Brel, said the name of the Brel delegate aloud, with her honorific, to the climbing number. At 4,212, the gallery had filled, off-shift archivists, the shuttle crew, two Coveni observers who had come expecting to log a human breaking and stood instead watching the gauge tick past their champion's mark, and On spoke Charol's name to the number, and one of the Coven, a soldier with campaign scarring across both shoulders, made a sound On declined to translate. And then the count kept climbing, and the gallery went silent because there were no more names. Past 5,000, the gauge was above every mark in 11,000 years of ledger. Past 7,000, On told me, the silence changed kind, from dread to something the Atheni language needed a compound word for, which they built on the spot, in the gallery, that hour, the way languages do when reality outgrows the stock. Hethoven Surat, the patience that attacks. They tell me it is in dictionaries now, with the date of coinage. 9,000, 9,900. The recitation had no procedure left, so On did the only thing an archivist knows in the presence of the unprecedented. Read the whole list again, from the beginning, all 41 names, every fallen delegate of every fallen species out loud in order, never shortening it, while the number above their heads climbed through 10,000. And then the gauge stopped and did not reset, and the full door status glyphs changed to a configuration that existed in no manual, and the door opened from the inside, which it had never done, and a gray-haired human in a plain coat walked out, carrying his own weight a little carefully, like a man at the end of a long harvest day, and said, in scholar clean Atheni in the falling meter they reserve for matters of record. Archivist, your ledger closes last entry, Saul 1 delegate, iterations 10,000 verdict. Unbroken, the hour is decommissioned by treaty, and I will need a great deal of paper. I am told. I then asked whether anyone had a kettle. The articles executed faster than any treaty I have shepherded, because, for the first time in my career, the counterparty's compliance problem was eagerness. The shelf came down within the month. I was not present for the unsealing of the shavings. That was Atheni work, archivist work. 11,000 years of kept last hours released to their estates like ash given back to rivers, but I was on the gallery deck when the Coveni ship came for what was Charol's, and I was still there, 11 days later, when the message arrived from the Coven homeworld, relayed with the kind of formatting errors that happen when the sender's hands are not steady. Charol had spoken. 4 words, his first in 200 years, to his great-granddaughter at his bedside, in the old champion's dialect. The message gave the words. I have them framed in my study, in his script and mine, and I will not put them in this account, because they are his, and some things you keep by not handing them around. I will tell you only that when I read them, I had to go out and stand in the corridor for a while, and an Atheni archivist pretended very courteously not to see, and that of all the cargo my career ever moved, those 4 words are the tonnage I am proudest of. The Brel sent a delegation of contemplatives to sit 1 full day in silence on the gallery deck, facing the fold door, which I am given to understand is the highest honor their order pays, and which Ereval, who could perceive the gallery when it chose, later described to me, hesitantly, as the first gift it was ever given that it did not have to take. The restitution began that winter. It continues as I write this and will continue past my death and my grandchildren's. The tide and the archivists, hour by hour, rebuilding the records of civilizations that exist nowhere else but in the memory of the thing that ended them. The Atheni assigned it a permanent working delegation. They had to expand the archive twice in the first decade. There are species in those stacks now, whole languages, whole liturgies that the galaxy had lost and has back, every line of them written out by the being that took them, which is not redemption. Nobody on the gallery deck uses that word, but it is the nearest thing the dark offers, and the dead are read aloud once a year, all of them, and the reading takes 11 days, and they never shorten the list. I went home for the apple harvest as instructed. I want to write the homecoming honestly, because the committee's version has me striding off the shuttle into history, and what actually happened is that Ada met me at the field gate, looked at me the way she looks at me when I have been away too long, half welcome and half a ledger, and said, You've gone older behind the eyes, Sam. And I said, I'll tell you all of it slowly, and she said, good. The kettle's on, and the kettle was on, and we let it boil. It took me the better part of a year to tell her all of it slowly. Some of it she got at the kitchen table, some over the wall in spring with the frost-heaved stones spread out around us like a sentence taken apart for repair. She listened the way she has always listened, hands busy, eyes on the work. And when I finally told her about loop 704, the rendering, the gloves, the 4 minutes I had let myself look, she was quiet for a while, setting a stone, trying it, turning it again, And then she said, "You told it I hum?" I told it the hum was the dearest thing I own. "I don't hum," said Ada, who was humming when she said it. Some hymn her mother kept, off-key, under her breath, and I have an even and diplomatic temperament. Ask anyone in 3 spiral arms, and it was very nearly not equal to that moment. The medical board ruled me fit, with findings. The findings run 40 pages and amount to this. I aged 1 subjective year in 61 minutes, my body did not, and my mind holds 10,000 hours of a single morning without damage they can name, which troubles them more than damage would. They asked me, in the Baltus clinical language available, how that could be. I told them what I had told Araval. I had been in training for it my whole life, and so has everyone they have ever met, and the only unusual feature of my case is that I knew it. Every human being who has held a job, kept a marriage, raised a child, tended a parent, worked a field, said a prayer, or practiced an instrument has done 10,000 hours of a single morning. We just take them one at a time, with sleep in between, and call it a life. The hour showed me mine all at once. The board did not find this responsive. Ada did. The committee debrief took 11 weeks, and the strangest hour of it was the one where I had to explain to a room of admirals and ministers who had sent me out as ablative armor and gotten back a treaty why Article 4 was not a concession. An admiral I will not name, a good man, bone-tired, who had spent the whole crisis drawing up contingencies for evacuating Earth's children to the outer system, kept circling it. We had the thing beaten, it begged, and you gave it a standing appointment with humanity forever. Why? I gave the room the lighthouse answer, and the saltwater answer, and the answer about sentences and testimony, and none of it landed, and finally I stopped trying to make it a strategy and told them the truth at the bottom of the strategy. Because when its count went, somebody kept it with him, I said. Gentlemen, on my worst loop, 8,000 hours in, when I lost the kettle and the hum and the word, the only soul in reach was the enemy. And the enemy walked my stones with me and handed me back my count at the 44th joint. Nothing in its 11,000 years explains it doing that. One thing in our 10,000 hours does. It had been watching how humans keep things, and it tried it once and it held. That is the only weapons test that matters from the entire engagement. The kindness propagates. It is the most contagious thing we ship. Article 4 is not charity, and it is not risk. It is the maintenance schedule on the one piece of ordnance that actually won this war, and I have never in 31 years signed anything I was surer of. The room was quiet for a moment, and then the tired admiral said, "And if it relapses? If the visit stopped working and the hour reopens, then we will be the species that tried to teach a lighthouse to keep ships, instead of wreck them, and failed and has to fight it anyway," I said, which is exactly the species we were last year, minus the trying. The trying is not free, Admiral. It costs an hour a year. I have spent worse hours for less. They ratified all 4 articles. The vote, I am told, was not close, and then there was nothing left of the affair but the living of it, which is the part treaties never write down. The wall, the harvest, the winters, my granddaughter's cello working its way from weather toward climate, and once a year by our calendar on the same date, at the same hour, a shuttle, a fold, a door that opens from the inside, and 88 flagstones in a light that moves now, and a table with 2 cups, and the keeper of the place already seated, waiting, like a child on the last morning of the year who has rehearsed all 364 days for this, the visit, the single unrepeated hour. Hours. I have kept 11 of them now. The first visit, the year after the treaty, I taught it cards. 2-handed whist, my father's game, the one he played against himself in the wintering shed with a deck gone soft as cloth. Araval learned the rules in 1 trick and the game in none at all. Because the game is not the rules, the game is the long patience of the deck, the way the same 52 stones get reset every hand into a wall that has never existed before and will never exist again. 52 cards, it said, holding them in its borrowed hands like relics, and more arrangements of them than there are atoms in your son's whole family. You carried this in your coat, an infinity of unrepeatable hours, folded flat, and your species hands it to children on rainy afternoons. I told it we also used the deck to tell fortunes, and it considered that, and said that it could believe it, since the deck had just told its own. The second visit, it had questions saved up, a year's worth, written out in meter on Atheni archive paper, numbered. The third visit, I brought photographs. The wall, the orchard, the kitchen, the kettle. It looked at the kettle a long time. It is smaller than I rendered it, it said, which is the closest thing to an apology that ever passed between us on the subject of loop 704, and I let it stand because some apologies are better load-bearing than spoken. The 5th visit, Ada came. That was not in any article, and the committee fought it to the gallery door, and Ada attended to their objections with the same expression she gives the frost in March, and walked the 88 stones at my shoulder, and sat in the second chair, which I had never once seen filled, and poured her own water, and looked at the oldest mind in the catalog dark with her head a little to one side, half welcome and half ledger. "So you're the hour thief," she said. "Retired," said Ereval. They got on. I had expected it. The way you expect weather you have farmed under for 30 years, and it still begared something in me to watch. My wife and the smoothing tide, talking kettles and frost and the keeping of lists, while the light moved and the cloud sea changed its swells below the rail. Near the bell hour's end, Ada was telling it about her grandfather's hands being under ours in the wall, and Ereval was still in the way I had spent 10,000 hours learning to read, the stillness that is not armor but attention, and it said quietly, "Madam Core, your husband spent 10,000 repetitions of one morning in this place, and on the worst of them, the thing he reached for was the sound you make when you believe no one is listening." And Ada, who does not hummed off-key, some hymn her mother kept, on purpose for the first time in her life giving it away knowingly, "The dearest thing I own," handed across the table to a being that had once tried to counterfeit it and failed, and Ereval listened the way the gallery had listened to the count, past 9,000, and when she finished it said, "Thank you, I will keep it," and I knew by then exactly how much that sentence weighed, coming from the only creature in existence that had needed 11,000 years to learn the difference between keeping and taking. The rotation began in year 6, as the article specified. I had insisted on the rotation clause myself. Institutions outlive their founders, or they are not institutions, they are anecdotes. A school teacher from the southern hemisphere took year 6, and came home unbroken and unbothered, having spent her hour being examined on the pedagogy of repetition, why children demand the same story every night, word perfect, and protest revisions. A Brel contemplative took year 8, by their order's request, the first non-human visitor, and the two of them sat the entire 60 minutes in silence, which Ereval afterward called the finest conversation it had had since me, and I have chosen not to take that personally. A Kaven took year 10, Charol's great-granddaughter. She brought the old champion's campaign flute and played it on the terrace, the same 4-note muster call her people have sounded for 900 years, again and again for the better part of the hour, and the keeper of the fold stood at the rail and listened to a repetition that was a resurrection, every note of it, because the voice that taught her the fingering had spent 200 years on a shelf in that very room. But the date in between, year by year, is mine while I last, and this past spring I kept the 11th, and I will close the account there, because the account is a wall and a wall wants a coping stone. I am 69 now. The walk up from the fold door takes me longer than it did, and at the 44th flagstone the joint catches my heel, the way it has caught it 10,011 times, and the voice from the table murmurs the joint before I reach it. Every year, our oldest joke, which is not a joke at all but a liturgy, the way the best ones never are, we played whist. We talked about the restitution. 4 more recovered civilizations entered into the archive this year. The reading now takes 13 days. They never shorten the list. We talked about my granddaughter, who is 22 and plays the cello in a city orchestra, and who has promised, when her name comes up on the rotation someday, to bring the instrument and play the 8 bars, the same 8 bars from the winter she was 11, because I told her once what the hour taught me and she has never forgotten it, that the same 8 bars, kept long enough, stop being notes and become weather, and weather, kept long enough, becomes climate, and climate is just the universe's word for character. Near the end of the hour, the light went long and gold across the cloud sea, real evening coming on, time moving in that place as faithfully now as anywhere in the catalog dark, and we stood at the rail, the envoy and the tide, 2 old keepers of one mended lighthouse, not talking, in the way of men who have said 10,000 hours worth and earned the quiet. Then the bell swung on its wooden arm, the way it has swung at the end of every visiting hour for 11 years, ringing not a sentence anymore but a closing time, and Ereval turned from the rail and asked me the question it asks every year, the question it once dreaded and now saves up for, rehearsed 364 days, the single word I drove into it 10,000 times as a hammer and handed back to it once as a key, spoken now the way a child speaks it at the end of the story, the way my granddaughter spoke it at the end of the 8 bars, the way my whole stubborn, wall-mending, kettle-boiling, psalm-wheeling species has spoken it at the end of every hard hour since we chased our first dawn across the grass, hopeful, undefeated, ready to go around once more. Again, and I gave it the answer I will give it as long as my count holds, the same answer every year, worn in and never worn out, the only word in any ledger that ever beat the hour and the only one it ever needed, again.